Hello Year 6, and today we're looking at bar charts. Let's have a little think. What does a bar chart look like? You might want to pause it and just remind yourself of all the things that are involved with bar charts. Okay, so now let's have a little think and think about what a bar graph needs. We need to label the axes. So this axis that you can see here, the number of people, that's the label, that's the y-axis. The way I like to remember it is the y-axis, it's got a tail, hasn't it, the letter Y, and it goes down from top to bottom, so that's how I remember the axes. But what's covered over there is the label for the x-axis. What do you think that is? Okay, so yeah, types of fruit. Now, we also need a title. It helps to explain what the data is showing and makes it much more meaningful. That's often missed out, those few things, so do remember to label your axes and to label your bar chart as well. Give it a title. Now, this is a bit confusing to look at, but can you see the red arrow? It's pointing at a line. Now, we need to remember to number the line, not the square. So you can see that 35 is right on a line. So that's something else we need to remember when making a bar graph. Okay, we're going to have a quick look at the scale now. Now, if you look to where the red arrow is pointing, this is the scale. It goes up the y-axis and it's the numbers there. You can see that my scale goes from 0 to 40. Okay, now what the red arrow is pointing at is it's a really important bit, is the gap between each of those numbers. Now you can see that I've gone up in 5s. I've gone up consistently. I don't sometimes go up in 2s or 1s. Every gap is a gap of 5. Now look at the space between those gaps as well. They're all the same. That gap is exactly the same between every one. So it goes up in the same number and the space between the numbers is the same. You might decide to leave 2 squares, you might decide to leave 1. But whatever you do, it has to be the same each time. Now, this is the scale goes up to 40. We talked about that, didn't we? The reason I chose 40 is if you have a look at the types of fruit along the bottom, along the x-axis, you can see the blueberries. Now, the blueberries was my biggest number and it came to just below 40. So I wanted to make sure that my scale went up to 40. I decided to go up in 5, so I wanted to use as much of the space as I could. If I'd have gone up in 10s, it would have been a much shorter scale. So make your scale as big as you can. And now for the bars. So we're on the x-axis now at the bottom. And here we've got the types of fruits. So as you can see, my bars are brightly coloured. You might also notice that they're the same size. So if you have a look at the apple bar, if you were to measure the orange bar, it would be exactly the same. They're the same size. There's a gap between each one as well, and that gap is the same size. And this is something else you really need to remember. We must remember those labels. So we label each of the axes. So here is my y-axis label, the number of people. Don't forget your x-axis either, so both axes need a label. And of course, a title. It's really quite meaningless without the title, so we absolutely have to remember that. So how did I know it was going to be a bar graph? Okay, so what was it that I was measuring? I was measuring the number of people. Now, if I can count that data, then it's going to be a bar graph. If I measure it with a ruler or a thermometer or a clock, it will probably be a line graph. So as I was counting the number of people, it's going to be a bar graph. Okay, so just to fill you in with what data we're going to be working with, in class we've been looking at gathering data to show the variation in Year 6. So we asked the children if they could measure their hand span, so have a look at what we asked them to do. So we spread our fingers as far apart as we could and we measured from the tip of the thumb to the tip of the little finger. And we recorded this data in seconds. Now, their children called out to us what their data was and we recorded it on a table. So this is the table that we used in class to gather the data. Now, as you can see, centimetres in the heading is red. That's because we don't want to have centimetres cm recorded in the table. We just want it in the heading so that actually in the main body of the table all we have are numbers. So that's really important for us to remember. So this is a group, a bubble, that was working in one of the classrooms in Year 6. And you can see their data. Can you see if there's variation? Can you just think about how you know there is variation? Okay, so you might have said we know there's variation because the sizes are different, so people aren't all identical. So we decided that we would actually like to do something with this data and look at the frequency. So we've got a frequency table on the right. Can you see the frequency table? That frequency table, it measures how often each of them come up, each of the measurements. So if you look at the top row of the frequency table, you can see it's got the measurement of 14.0 to 14.9. Now, how many times did that measurement come up? Have a look at my table with the children's names and their measurements in. Okay, that came up once for Cash. Cash had a measurement of 14.9, so I wrote a 1 in that column. So this is just one class's data, but we're going to put it with the rest of Year 6 data all together. So this is the data for the entire Year 6, and you can see that there's variation across the entire of Year 6 that are in school. Can you see which measurement occurred the most frequently? Okay. Now, what were we actually measuring here? I know that we've got a measurement, we've got numbers, haven't we? But is that what I'm measuring now? No, I'm measuring how often those spans appear. So that's the data I'm measuring. So we're going to start off by doing our axes. We've got the x-axis and the y-axis. I'm going to very early on label those axes because it's quite often forgotten, isn't it? Remembering that this is the data I'm measuring, the frequency. I want that to appear on the y-axis. So which of these would be the right label for the y-axis? Okay, so did you have them around that way? Hopefully you did. So I've also put a title on. It's good to get the title on early in the proceedings, otherwise it's easily forgotten. And a title is so important, it tells you what the graph is showing. Okay, now we come on to our x-axis. So you can see the first bit of data is highlighted in red. That's my first group. So I've decided that that's going to be the size of one of my bars when it comes to plotting the data as well. And if you look above the 14 to 14.9, you can see that it takes up 3 squares. Now, if you check above all the others, you will see that they all take up 3 squares. Now, between each set of data, I've got a square in between, so a square space. Now, we're quite familiar with plotting these bars, aren't we? Don't forget that we've labelled the line. So on our y-axis, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of those is on a line. Now, you can see why I've done that now. So when we plot the one bar, you can see clearly where to stop. It just goes up to that line. So I've plotted the data for the first 2 sets, haven't I? For 14.0 to 14.9 and for 15 as well. And we can see that one person had each of those. Now look at the next set, is 16.0 to 16.9. No people, so of course I leave it blank. Should I leave 16 to 16.9 off my x-axis? What do you think? Now I've decided to leave it on there because it's quite important that nobody has a handspan in my group that was that size. Okay, so look at the next number then, 17.0 to 17.9. How many people had a measurement that was in that group? Okay, 3. So where will my bar go? Now it's important to notice that I'm going to leave enough space for the 0. We want to show there's nothing there. And enough space between the bars. So where do you think my next bar will go? Okay, so what would I need to do if I wanted to complete this table? Have a look at the y-axis. That's fine, isn't it? It goes up high enough, but then have a look at the x-axis. It's not quite long enough, is it? Just for the purpose of showing you this graph, I haven't drawn all the way across. I just wanted to show you a little bit of it. but think to yourself about how much longer I'd have to make this graph. Now, did you notice what's happened? What's changed? What's different? Yeah, the frequency's changed. So I've collated some data from a few of the other groups in Year 6. It's not all the children in Year 6, but quite a few. Now, this is what your task is going to be. You're going to create a bar graph. So what will be the same about my bar graph that I've been using, and what will be different? You might want to pause the video for a minute and have a think about that. Okay, so first of all, let's think about the y-axis. Is it going to be high enough just going up to 4? Let's look at the biggest number in that set of data. Okay, the biggest number is 8, so we need to go above 8 to 9. Okay, so we're going to need to make that y-axis taller. So think about the gap between each number as well. We just talked, didn't we, how we hadn't finished the x-axis. So make sure that you finish the x-axis. Go along, remembering the gaps and remembering that I chose to have 3 squares for each of those measurements, didn't I, with a gap in between. So your task today is to draw a bar graph to show this data. Okay, don't forget the titles and definitely label your axes as well. We'd be really interested to see them when you've finished.